Welcome to the third lesson in our series, Fishing with Jesus, lessons on loving the lost. This is kind of a quick summary of the class that took place in our previous week. The audio and video got messed up for that. So I'm just going to go through and run through these slides and give you an overview of what we talked about, but try to touch on all the points that we looked at together. So let's move on to the first assumption, that the assumption that we've had for this entire class, and that is this: God's desire and design is for every disciple of Jesus to be involved in the work of spreading the good news, that is the gospel, and making more disciples. The reason that we have a class like this, a study like this, is because we believe that every Christian, every follower of Jesus is called to be part of this work of fishing with Jesus. Now, this is not, as we've said in weeks past, this is not a statement that you're going to find in just one verse in Scripture that makes this abundantly clear, or several verses that have all of these points spelled out explicitly. What instead we find in the New Testament, supported from the Old Testament, this idea of being blessed that we might be a blessing. We see that spelled out in a variety of ways, worked out in a variety of ways, so that a number of different kinds of passages come together to paint a picture that mirrors this assumption, that proves this idea here, that confirms the idea that every follower of Jesus is called to fish for Jesus. Now, let's couple that assumption, or that assumption leads to an approach that we've been using in this study. And that approach is starting with Jesus. We start with Jesus, and we start with his call to become fishers of men. Now, he did issue that call to specific individuals in that passage and parallel passages like Mark 1:16 through 18. He did call those men 2,000 years ago to be fishers of men. But in light of the assumption that all Christians are called to participate in this work of making disciples through the gospel, then we see that this idea of being fishers of men is one way to express God's desire and design in that area. So we have been beginning with that call of Jesus to become fishers of men. We have been, through our study of the Gospels, watching and listening to Jesus himself. Why? Well, in order to learn how he casts a net of grace when we look at the Gospels. What is he doing to cast a net of grace with the people around him and then draw people into God's boat of eternal life? So that's our approach in this class. And as we've used that approach, we've been able to learn several principles, at least a couple principles so far in our first two lessons. The first one that we saw is this idea of being with the lost. If we hope to be fishers of men, we need to be where the fish are. We see that with Jesus all throughout his earthly ministry, that he is spending time with people who do not know him. He is spending time with people who are spiritually lost. He is eating dinner with them. He is having conversations with them. He is sitting on the hillside and talking with them. We need to follow his example in that same way. We also need to be loving the lost. When he was with them, when Christ was with them, he was loving these people. And we see that in a variety of ways. He was encouraging his disciples to do the same thing of caring for people, whether that meant an encouraging word, whether that meant a work of mercy in their life, a miraculous healing. There were many examples of the way that he loved and cared for people. He had compassion on people. Well, both of those ideas are leading us to our study tonight. They are the foundation for our study tonight as we get more specific in terms of these fishing principles. So, in light of that approach to look at God's word, we want to look together tonight or today or whenever you're listening to this to this recording. We're going to look in this study to Luke chapter 20, verses 20 through 26. This is what we read there. Now, again, as I read this, keep in mind this idea of fishing. What does this passage teach us about fishing? How does Jesus exemplify fishing for souls, for people in this passage? Chapter 20, verse 20. So they, that's the scribes and the chief priests, as we learned from an earlier verse, they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere that they might catch him, that is Jesus, they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked Jesus, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? Verse 23, but he perceived their craftiness, and he said to them, show me a denarius. That's a coin, a Roman coin. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. He said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said. But marveling at his answer, they became silent. So some questions about this passage, questions for you to consider. Did Jesus know what these spies were trying to do and why? Well, we do know that he recognized what they were trying to do, don't we? We know that from verse 23. See it here? But he perceived their craftiness and said to them in response. So yes, Jesus knew what these spies were trying to do. And why. We know from the Gospels that Jesus often has special divine insight into what people were doing, why they were thinking what they were thinking. He could read their minds, their feelings. He had a sense of that as, not surprisingly, as God in human flesh. He could do that. So yes, he probably understood fully what was motivating them and the broader strategy of the religious authorities against him. Another question. Could Jesus have given them the very best seminar on the relationship between the spiritual and political spheres, between our civic duties and our kingdom obligations? Well, yes, he could have. Again, as God in human flesh, Jesus could have taught in a way unparalleled in addressing the questions that they were raising in public to him. These questions about their obligations to God and their obligations to the Roman government, and how those two things might come into conflict. He could have explained to them to a degree that no one else could have ever done to them on those topics. So a final question, why did he respond instead if he could have given them the most in-depth response that was possible on this subject? Why did he respond instead with just one question? Well, that raises this idea of question asking. We have here's as you can see on the screen, a quote from a theologian named Conrad Gempf. He makes this observation. In the first gospel to have been written, the Gospel of Mark, there are 67 episodes which there is any sort of conversation at all. Even when you are careful to count double questions as one question, we have 50 questions of Jesus in those 67 episodes. Gempf writes that that's a lot, and the pattern seems to hold throughout the Gospels. He makes this conclusion. Jesus was more likely to ask you something than to tell you something. So a really interesting observation in regard to Jesus and question asking. How much question asking questions was a part of Jesus' interaction with people, his ministry to people, whether those be people who did not know him or people who knew him, like his disciples, people who knew him like the religious authorities. Jesus asked a lot of questions. And there are a variety of reasons that Jesus would ask questions. Sometimes he did ask questions that were just rhetorical questions. He wasn't looking for an answer. The answer was kind of assumed when he asked the question. But what do we see in this passage that we just looked at here from Luke chapter 20, verses 20 through 26? Well, we can draw, I think, some of these if we just observe what Jesus was doing and think carefully about his strategy. This is what he was doing. Number one, he started with an object lesson, if you notice. This is not necessarily related to question asking, but the two are related in this passage. This object lesson was actually using an object, a coin, to make his points. And whether it's an actual object like a coin, or it's a real life situation, Jesus would often use that kind of thing to frame his response, to teach something. So that's an interesting way that he begins by using this coin, this object lesson to start get the ball rolling. Number two, in Luke chapter 20, verses 20 through 26, the question brought out something they already knew or that was publicly known. Remember the question that he put to these guys. Once they produced the coin, he simply asked them whose image was on the coin. So in asking that, he knew that they knew the answer to that. He knew that those who were listening knew the answer to that as well. So this is something that we learn from in this idea of common knowledge, that as we ask people questions, we can we can focus in on things that they already know and draw those out. What do we do with something that somebody already knows, an area of an issue of common knowledge? Well, that the question then provides an opportunity to build on or reorient that knowledge. So using something they already knew, Jesus builds on that idea, or at least here he reorients that idea of, if this coin belongs to Caesar, therefore there's a lesson that you can draw from that idea, that truth. And that lesson is simply that you give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and you give to God what belongs to God. Now, ultimately, the fourth point here in terms of question asking in this passage, we know Jesus always declared the truth. He never declared anything but the truth in his ministry. But he often, as we heard earlier about those 67 episodes from the Gospel of Mark, and how 50 of them had Jesus using questions, asking questions, he often helped people discover the truth via questions. So that points us and brings us back to the reality of either telling people the truth or helping them discover the truth. Those two are not pitted against one another. We often have to tell people the truth, things they don't know, but we can often tell them the truth by building on what they already know and asking them questions so that they will be able to arrive at a certain truth on their own, has a wonderful effect in helping that person really grasp the truth. And I think that the object lesson combined with the question that Jesus asked and how he built on that question is really key to what he was doing in this passage, and really leads to a lot of important lessons for us. It exemplifies some really cool things about question asking. In light of verse 23, remember verse 23, why was question asking especially helpful in this situation? Well, if you remember verse 23, it talked about he perceived their craftiness. That is what was motivating them to come and brown nose and flatter him and then ask the question that they did. So we could say that question asking was especially helpful since their goal was to discredit Jesus in public and thus provide grounds for accusations against him. His question forced them, in a sense, to answer their own question and ultimately be publicly frustrated. So that is important to see how he was using the question in this context, given the particulars, the specifics, details of that specific situation. Now, let me give you some examples. You might, if you stop and think about questions that Jesus used, or sorry, Jesus asked, can you think of any? You might have one or two that pop into your head that during his earthly ministry, what are some questions that Jesus asked? Well, I'll give you a few here that you'll see on the screen. There are well over, there's really over 100 questions that Jesus asked, probably more than that if we combine the Gospels. But one of those is from our last lesson. When we talk about loving the lost, there's two questions in that passage. The exchange that Jesus has with the lawyer that leads into the parable of the Good Samaritan. The questions are, what is written in the law? How do you read it? So Jesus put the question back to the lawyer who came to him. And then that final question after the parable, which of these three, the three men who passed by on the road and saw the man who had been beaten up and robbed, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? So Jesus doesn't simply just say who proved to be a neighbor and make his point. He actually has the man answer the question and make the point for him. Another question, a famous question that Jesus asked of his disciples, when we're just talking about questions that Jesus asked during his earthly ministry, was one we find in Matthew 16:13. Who do people say that the Son of Man is? Who do you say that I am? Is the question he had after that. Here's another question that he put to the religious authorities. Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit, will not take hold of it and lift it out? So that was, of course, something that Jesus asked when the religious authorities were giving him a hard time about healing on the Sabbath. A kind of a rhetorical question, assuming that yes, anybody would pull their own sheep out of a pit. So, but the question is stinging, isn't it? When it really makes his point and what he's asking of them in light of the criticisms that they are lodging against him. What are you seeking is a very simple question that he puts to two of the disciples of John the Baptist, one being Andrew, who began to follow him, according to John chapter 1. Another question he put to the religious leaders when they were going to stone him. He said, for which of them, that is, which of my good works are you going to stone me? Obviously, there's some sarcasm, I think, in that question that he's putting to them. But that question does drive the conversation along to the end that Jesus has intended in his conversation in John chapter 10. So just some examples, just five or six of many, many questions that Jesus asked. So what is the principle here in terms of fishing with Jesus? Well, adding to this idea of being with the lost and loving the lost, we can talk about questioning the lost. Not questioning, of course, in terms of interrogating the lost, like a police officer would, or a detective would question somebody who's a suspect. No, this is asking questions of the lost as we see Jesus, as we so often see Jesus doing, and why that's so important. So let's think about, let me just give you some thoughts and encouragements in light of this principle of question asking in regard to fishing with Jesus. You might ask some questions. Here's some questions to think about in terms of question asking. What might be the biggest challenges when it comes to asking the lost questions? That's something to consider as you've heard this lesson tonight. some things might just be popping into your mind. You might have some concerns about this idea. You might feel lost in terms of asking questions of the lost. Those are good. This is a good question to tackle. What are the challenges? What are some examples of generic questions we might ask those we're trying to reach? Just generic things that might be conversation starters. Basic questions related to people and life and spirituality that might be real helpful in getting that conversation going or continuing that conversation. What are some examples of personalized questions that we might ask those that we're trying to reach? Once we get to know somebody, you might have a very specific question that you want to ask them. Are we thinking in terms of question asking when we're hearing and learning things about other people? And this we'll pick up more of this in our fourth lesson. But here are some points I want to leave you with in terms of question asking. Asking questions, it's important to remember that asking questions is not an end in itself. To fish for Jesus it can involve asking questions. It doesn't always have to involve asking questions. But when we do ask questions, as Jesus used question asking as an approach in his ministry, we're doing that in order to help people come to understand the truth that God has revealed in the person and work of Christ. We are using questions to try to direct a conversation to the gospel. So just asking questions is not an end. We can't pat ourselves in the back because we've asked lots of important, insightful questions to somebody. Now, it may be that you leave somebody with a lot of good questions, and that might be the end of the conversation, but you're always praying that those questions are stirring them so that they want to find answers to those questions. And whether it's you or someone else, your prayer should be that they do find those answers in Christ. So we want to keep that in mind, that we use questions in order to further that end of sharing the gospel, the good news with others. Asking questions recognizes the individual. There are some kind of cookie cutter approaches to sharing your faith out there, and those have their merits. I think there's some helpful things about learning some basic things about sharing the gospel with others. But if we don't qualify that, we might think that there's a cookie cutter approach just to actually sharing the gospel, not just to learning, but to sharing it. And we'll do the same things over and over again, maybe indifferent to the individual that we're talking with. Again, in lesson 4, we're going to kind of dig into this more. But when you're asking questions of somebody, it does recognize that you're talking to a unique, specific individual. And so it may not always be, your cookie cutter approach may not always be the best way. It might always be the best fit in that conversation with that specific individual. Asking questions helps others discover the truth. So this is this idea that maybe the difference between declaring the truth and discovering the truth. We do need to declare the truth to people, but helping them to discover the truth for themselves, as I indicated before, and I think as we all know, it has a profound way of bringing that truth home in a really powerful way, in an effective way. And it's ultimately where we want people to land, not just hearing something, but really owning the truth for themselves. A fourth point here, asking questions requires that we listen. That's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? But what a great reminder. We are. If you're like me, then you're always more tempted to say something than ask a question, to say something than ask something. And even when we're tempted to say something and we ask a question, we may not really be listening to the response that we're getting from the other person. we may be simply trying to think about the next thing that we're going to say while the person's talking. No. If we're asking questions, we really want to be listening carefully, because God has something. We believe God has something for us in listening carefully to what somebody else is saying to us. And if we're asking a question because we want to hear a specific answer, or we want to build on an answer that we know is a common knowledge kind of thing, then we need to make sure that we're hearing what they're saying and hearing that point that we can build on. Finally, asking questions is about humility, not humiliation. Yes, Jesus, because of the public setting, because of what he knew that those Jewish leaders were trying to do, there was an element of humiliation. He was frustrating them publicly, but as we do that, we're not trying to humiliate anyone. Yes, there may be situations that parallel what Jesus was doing if we're in a public setting and other people are being affected by the conversation. But ultimately, when we're asking questions of somebody, we're doing that from a heart of humility. We want them to know the truth, as we want them to know the riches of Christ in their poverty, just as we were poor before we were given the riches of Christ. And we ask questions not as those who have all the answers, but we have some of the answers, and we have the answer, Jesus, for them. So we're asking questions with real humility, and not seeking to burn anybody or prove that we're smarter than anybody else. So hopefully those are helpful, those points, when we're thinking about this idea of how do you use questions in ministering to others and ultimately sharing your faith. Here's just a summary of this lesson. If we want to fish like Jesus and for Jesus, we should ask questions of those that we're trying to draw in order to discover more about who we're addressing, and ultimately asking questions to help them discover more about their need of needs. That's hopefully a good summary of what we just saw in this lesson about question asking. A bit of homework, if you're up for the challenge, take time this week to come up with a few generic questions. Conversation starters. Those might be questions like, what do you think lies beyond death's door? If someone asked you what's the meaning of life, what would you say? Do you believe that that God is personal or that God is impersonal? Why is forgiveness? Do you think it's something like forgiveness is important? Where does love come from? I don't know. There's all sorts of things, all sorts of things that you could ask to get a good conversation started. So come up with a few of those yourself, and keep those in your back pocket, as the saying goes. And also maybe come up with a personalized question that you could ask your one. If there's one person that God has you focused on, that you're ministering to, what's a personalized question based on what you know of that person you could ask them that might further a conversation. And of course, pray also for opportunities to ask these kinds of questions. As we do that, I believe God will answer those prayers and provide us with the opportunities, and may God find us faithful to really walk through those doors that He opens for the good of another person, for our good, and for ultimately for His glory. Thanks, you guys.